You believe the world is held together by laws, gravity, physics, cause and effect. You're wrong. It's held together by a stained, laminated list of rules tacked to a corkboard in this forgotten 24-hour convenience store. I'm the guy who has to follow them, because my real job isn't to sell coffee, it's to make sure the sun rises tomorrow. And you should be very, very scared, because tonight, I think something is about to break the most important rule of all. The hum was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't the aggressive, mechanical buzz of a faulty freezer, but a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate right in the back of my teeth. It was the sound of tired electricity, of old fluorescent bulbs bathing everything in a sterile greenish-white light that made the brightly colored chip bags look sickly and pale. The Starlight Stop and Shop was less a beacon in the night and more of an isolated humming island in an ocean of asphalt and darkness. My first shift, and if I was lucky, the first of many. Student loans wait for no one. The man who hired me, Arthur, looked like he was personally holding the building together through sheer exhausted willpower. He was a gaunt figure, his company-issued polo shirt hanging off his bony frame. His eyes, sunken and dark, darted around the store, not like he was looking for shoplifters, but like he was checking for structural weaknesses in the fabric of reality itself. "It's all right, kid," he said, his voice raspy like he'd been gargling gravel. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "The job is easy, simple. You're just a presence. You keep the lights on, you mop if there's a spill, you sell the occasional trucker a cup of coffee that's been brewing since the Mesozoic era. You got it?" I nodded, trying to project an aura of competence I didn't feel. "Got it. Mop, coffee, presence, no problem." "Good." He took a deep, shuddering breath and finally looked at me. The weariness in his eyes was profound. It wasn't just, "I hate my job" tired, it was an ancient, soul-deep exhaustion. "There's one more thing. The most important thing. Your actual job." He shuffled behind the counter, his worn-out shoes squeaking on the linoleum. From a drawer beneath the cash register, he pulled out a single sheet of A4 paper, laminated and yellowed with age. The edges were grimy, the corners soft from being handled by countless nervous, sweaty hands. He slid it across the counter to me. At the top, in a bold, simple font, were the words, "Night Shift Rules." "This is it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't need to understand it, you don't need to question it. You just need to follow it, to the letter. You follow the list, you finish your shift, you get paid. You don't, well, you don't." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the humming air between us, thick and suffocating. I picked up the list. The plastic felt strangely warm. Is this some kind of joke? A hazing thing for the new guy? Arthur let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it. It was the sound of a wire snapping. "A joke, yeah, kid, in this place you'll pray for jokes." He grabbed his car keys from a hook on the wall. "I'm out of here. My shift is over. Yours has just begun. Whatever happens, you do not leave this store until you see the sun. Not for anything." He was out the door before I could ask another question. The little bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking farewell. Then silence, or rather, the return of the hum, which now seemed louder, more insistent. I was alone. I looked down at the list in my hand. My reflection stared back from the glossy surface. A pale, skeptical kid about to work a dead-end night job. I snorted, a little bubble of nervous laughter escaping my lips. A prank. It had to be. I started to read. Night Shift Rules. Your primary duty is to ensure these rules are followed. Selling merchandise is secondary. The integrity of the store is paramount. The front door must be locked precisely at midnight and unlocked precisely at 6 a.m. No exceptions. If a customer drops a coin and it rolls underneath a gondola or shelf, it is considered a loss. Do not attempt to retrieve it. What is under the shelves does not like to be disturbed. We have a wide selection of products, however, we do not and have never sold Celestial Crunch, cereal, or Amnesia brand soda. If a customer asks for these items by name, politely inform them we are out of stock. Do not engage in further conversation. Their memory of the request will fade shortly after they leave. Some customers will not appear on the security cameras. This is normal. Be polite to them. They are our best-paying customers. The payphone on the outside wall will sometimes ring. It has been disconnected since 1994. Do not answer it. The analog clock in aisle 2 will occasionally run backwards. If you notice this, turn your back to it immediately. Occupy yourself with restocking or cleaning until you are certain it has returned to normal. Do not let it see you watching it. If you hear crying coming from the dairy cooler, increase the temperature by 2 degrees for 15 minutes. This usually pacifies it. If your reflection in the freezer door glass waves at you, wave back. Politeness is crucial. Spills of a dark, thick, iridescent liquid may sometimes appear in aisle 4. Clean them using the special code black mop and bucket in the utility closet. Do not let the liquid touch your skin. Do not inhale the fumes. Do not, under any circumstances, turn off the radio. The classical music station keeps things calm. If a vintage black car with no headlights parks across the street for more than 1 minute, switch off the main Starlight Stop and Shop sign. You do not want it to know you are here. I finished reading and just stood there for a long moment, the list trembling slightly in my hand. It was elaborate, I had to give them that. Arthur had the dead-eyed commitment of a serious prankster. What's under the shelves? The Dust Bunny Mafia, I muttered to the empty store. And the clock runs backwards? What is it shy? I laughed again, louder this time, trying to fill the humming silence with my own disbelief. I tacked the list to the corkboard behind the counter, right next to a faded flyer for a missing cat. A joke. It was all a wonderfully creepy, well-thought-out joke. The first few hours were exactly what I expected. Dead quiet. I restocked the beef jerky, wiped down the coffee station, and mopped a small patch of floor where someone had tracked in mud. I scrolled through my phone. The blue light a comforting, normal glow in the eerie fluorescence of the store. A trucker came in around 11:30 p.m., bought a coffee and a pack of cigarettes, paid in cash, and left without saying a word. He showed up on the security camera just fine. See? Normal. At the stroke of midnight, I remembered rule number 2. For a second, I hesitated. It's a prank, my logical mind screamed, but Arthur's dead serious expression swam in my memory. With a sigh that was half annoyance, half unease, I walked to the front door and slid the deadbolt across. The solid thunk of the lock echoed in the store. It felt strangely final. I spent the next hour leaning against the counter, watching the empty highway outside. The world felt asleep, and I was the lone watchman in this ridiculous humming box of junk food. The classical music from the small radio on a high shelf was a thin but comforting barrier against the oppressive silence. I started to relax. The list was just a story, a piece of local folklore to spook the new guy. Around 2:15 a.m., an elderly woman came in. I hadn't even heard a car pull up. The bell on the door jingled, and there she was, a frail-looking woman in a dated floral dress, her grey hair in a tight bun. She smiled gently at me, her eyes clouded with cataracts. "Good evening, young man," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "Evening, ma'am. Can I help you with anything?" She nodded, her eyes scanning the shelves behind me. "I was just hoping to get a bottle of amnesia, the cherry one. It's the only thing that helps my husband sleep." The name hit me like a splash of ice water. Amnesia brand soda. Rule number 4. My heart started a low, heavy drumming against my ribs. Coincidence? It had to be a coincidence. Maybe there was a local brand I'd never heard of. "Amnesia soda, ma'am?" I asked, my voice a little tighter than I wanted. "That's right, dearie, the cherry one." My eyes darted to the list on the corkboard. The black text seemed to stare back at me. "Do not engage in further conversation." I swallowed hard, the inside of my mouth suddenly dry. I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," I said, forcing the words out. "It looks like we're out of stock on that one." The woman's gentle smile didn't waver. "Oh, what a shame. Well, thank you anyway." She turned and shuffled toward the door. I reflexively looked at the security monitor. The screen showed an empty aisle. The front door was closed. There was no one there. I looked back at the door in real life. The old woman was there, her hand on the handle. But on the screen, she was a ghost. My breath hitched. Rule number 5. Some customers will not appear on the security cameras. She left. The bell chimed. I stood frozen, my knuckles white on the edge of the counter. The hum of the store seemed to swell, filling my ears, my head. It was a prank. It was a coincidence. The security monitor was just glitching. There were 1,000 rational explanations. I needed to calm down. I took a deep breath and decided to do something mundane, something normal. I'd organize the candy bars. Yeah, simple, repetitive. I walked over to aisle 1, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. I was just turning the corner when a customer I hadn't seen, a man in a thick winter coat which was strange for September, fumbled with his wallet. A coin, a quarter, slipped from his fingers. It hit the linoleum with a sharp clink. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the silver disc spin, wobble, and then start to roll. It rolled directly toward the main chip gondola. It rolled with an almost deliberate slowness, as if drawn by some unseen force. With a final soft skitter, it disappeared into the thin black line of shadow beneath the lowest shelf. The man grunted in annoyance. Ah, damn it all. Dropped my last quarter. He looked at me. Hey kid, you mind grabbing that for me? I stared at the black void under the shelf. Rule number 3, it is considered a loss. Do not attempt to retrieve it. What is under the shelves does not like to be disturbed. Sir, My voice failed me. What? You got a bad back or something? It's right there, he insisted, pointing. My mind was screaming. It's a joke. It's just a dirty floor. Grab the man's quarter. But I couldn't move. The memory of Arthur's haunted eyes, the invisible woman on the camera, the impossible name of a soda, they were all piling up, forming a wall of inexplicable dread in my chest. I can't, sir. Store policy. Anything that goes under there, we can't get it. The excuse sounded insane as it left my lips. The man scoffed, his face twisting in disbelief. What kind of stupid policy is that? Fine, I'll get it myself. He took a step forward, starting to crouch down. No! The word ripped out of my throat, raw and panicked. Don't, please! He froze, startled by my outburst, and in that sudden, dead silence, we both heard it. It came from the darkness under the shelf. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a hiss. It was a soft, wet, dragging sound. The sound of old leather being pulled slowly across damp concrete. It was accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking, like insects chittering in the walls. And with the sound came a draft, a current of unnaturally cold air that flowed out from under the gondola and washed over our ankles. It smelled of deep, damp earth and something else. Something metallic and wrong, like old blood. The customer's face went slack, his skin turning the color of ash. His eyes were wide, fixed on the strip of darkness. He didn't say a word. He just slowly, deliberately, stood up straight. He backed away from the aisle, his gaze never leaving the spot where the coin had vanished. He turned and practically ran out of the store, the bell clanging violently behind him. I was alone again. Alone with the hum and the soft, dragging sound that was now fading back into silence. My legs gave out. I stumbled backwards, catching myself on a shelf of potato chips, the crinkling bags, a pathetic, normal sound in this place of impossible rules. I stared at the list on the corkboard 50 feet away. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a prank, it was a survival manual, and my shift had only just begun. I thought it was a prank, a way to scare the new night shift kid. But now I don't know what this place is. The rules aren't suggestions, they're the only thing keeping something at bay. If you want to find out what happens when one of these rules is broken, subscribe and like this video, because I have a feeling sooner or later one of them will be, and I need someone to know what happened here. The minutes after the man fled were the longest of my life. I didn't move from my spot in aisle 1, my back pressed against a wall of assorted snacks, the crinkling plastic a flimsy shield against the profound silence that had descended. The gentle dragging sound from beneath the gondola was gone, but its absence was somehow worse. It left a vacuum, a pocket of absolute dread that my mind rushed to fill with terrible possibilities. My breathing was shallow, a series of ragged little gasps. The store's fluorescent hum, once an irritating background noise, now felt like the purr of a sleeping predator. Every flicker of a light, every gurgle from the coffee machine was an omen. The list, tacked to the corkboard behind the counter, was no longer a piece of paper. It was a sacred text, a litany of impossibilities that had just proven itself to be the only truth that mattered within these four walls. Slowly, shakily, I forced my legs to move. I walked back to the counter, my eyes scanning the dark, forgotten corners of the store, half expecting to see something scuttling just at the edge of my vision. I felt watched, not by a person or even a creature, but by the building itself. The shelves were rows of silent teeth. The security cameras were unblinking eyes. This wasn't just a place of business. It was a carefully balanced ecosystem of terrors, and I was the new, clueless organism dropped into the middle of it. My job, I realized with a surge of cold panic, was not to be a clerk. My job was to be a zookeeper, or maybe a janitor in a haunted house, or most terrifyingly, a priest performing a series of rituals to appease gods I couldn't comprehend. The rest of the hour passed in a state of hypervigilance. I refilled the napkin dispensers with trembling hands. I wiped down a counter that was already spotless. I did anything to feel busy, to feel a sense of control, all while my ears strained for any sound that wasn't the radio or the hum. The classical music, which I'd barely noticed before, rule number 11, do not, under any circumstances, turn off the radio, now seemed critical. It felt like a ward, a thin layer of auditory insulation against everything else. Just before 3 a.m., a new sound began. It started faintly, almost imperceptible beneath the violins on the radio, a soft, high-pitched whimpering. I froze, a bottle of glass cleaner in my hand. The sound grew steadier, more distinct. It was the sound of a child crying, and it was coming from the back of the store. My blood ran cold. I crept from behind the counter, moving with a stealth I didn't know I possessed. I followed the sound down aisle 3, past the canned goods and pasta sauces, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was leading me to the dairy section. The sound was emanating directly from the large glass-fronted cooler. It was inside, a child sobbing in the cold. Every rational human instinct screamed at me to yank the door open, to help. A kid was trapped in a refrigerator, for God's sake. But my eyes darted to the laminated list in my mind's eye. Rule number 8. If you hear crying coming from the dairy cooler, increase the temperature by 2 degrees for 15 minutes. This usually pacifies it. The rule didn't say him or her. It said it. The crying intensified, punctuated by desperate little gasps and the word mama drawn out and heartbreaking. It sounded so real, so utterly, tragically real. This had to be an exception. This couldn't be one of them. This was a real emergency. I reached for the cooler handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The sobbing hitched, and for a split second, it was replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the very glass of the door. Then, just as quickly, it was back to the desperate crying. I recoiled as if I'd been burned. It was a trick, a lure. The politeness of the waving reflection, the transaction with the invisible woman. This was different. This was predatory. It was using my own humanity against me. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled resolve, I scrambled to the side of the unit, my fingers finding the small, greasy thermostat dial. The current setting was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. My hand shook so badly I could barely grip the plastic. I twisted it. The unit shuddered, and a different part of its internal machinery kicked on with a low groan. The new temperature, 36 degrees. I fumbled for my phone, my thumb jabbing at the screen to start a 15-minute timer. The moment I adjusted the temperature, the crying stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. It just cut out. The silence it left behind was more jarring than the sound itself. I stood there for the entire 15 minutes, my back against the opposite shelf, watching the cooler door, not daring to move until my phone buzzed in my pocket. When it did, I adjusted the thermostat back to its original temperature. Nothing else happened. The crying did not return. It had been pacified. I walked back to the counter, feeling hollowed out, a crucial piece of my empathy carved away and replaced with cold, pragmatic fear. Following the rules wasn't just about avoiding danger, it was about actively participating in the strangeness, about tending to it. The night wore on, a procession of surreal and terrifying obligations. At 3:47 a.m., I went to the back to use the restroom. The only mirror in the entire establishment was on the inside of the restroom door. As I washed my hands, I glanced up. My reflection stared back. It was me. Same tired eyes, same stupid haircut, same terrified expression. And then it smiled. A wide, knowing smile that I wasn't making. It raised its hand, the one not under the faucet in its mirrored world, and gave me a slow, deliberate wave. Rule number 9. If your reflection in the freezer door glass waves at you, wave back. Politeness is crucial. This wasn't the freezer door, but I knew with gut-wrenching certainty that the same principle applied. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest, but I slowly, mechanically, lifted my soapy hand and waved back at the grinning imposter in the mirror. Its smile widened. It then turned its head and looked at something over its shoulder, inside the mirrored bathroom, before turning back to me and winking. Then it was just my reflection again, perfectly mimicking my own horrified expression. I didn't dry my hands, I just fled the room. Around 4:30 a.m. I discovered the spill. I was walking the perimeter, a nervous habit I'd already developed, when I saw it in the middle of aisle 4. It wasn't large, just a puddle about the size of a dinner plate, but the substance itself was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a thick, black liquid, but it shimmered with a captive, internal light. As I moved, colors swirled across its surface like a galaxy trapped in oil. Deep purples, venomous greens, and streaks of impossible, stellar blue. It seemed to absorb the store's light rather than reflect it. Rule number 10. Clean them using the special code black mop and bucket in the utility closet. Do not let the liquid touch your skin. The utility closet was a place I had subconsciously avoided. It was just a dark little room, but it felt older than the rest of the store. Inside, behind a stack of industrial paper towels, was the kit. A single galvanized steel bucket and a mop with a head made of some strange, grey, fibrous material that looked vaguely organic. There were no instructions. With a sense of profound dread, I filled the bucket with water. The instant the water touched the grey fibers of the mop, the entire mop head hissed and steamed, and the water in the bucket turned cloudy and black. Holding my breath, I approached the spill. As I lowered the steaming mop, the iridescent liquid seemed to pull away from it, coalescing into a tighter, more perfect circle. When the mop finally made contact, the substance didn't dissolve or smear. It clung to the mop head, crawling up the fibers like it was alive, and was absorbed with a final soft sigh. The floor beneath was perfectly clean, not even a hint of residue. I carried the mop back to the closet as if I were handling radioactive waste, my skin crawling. The final trial of the night came at 5:12 a.m. The world outside was still pitch black, but the first hints of pre-dawn grey were a promise on the horizon. That's when the payphone on the outside wall rang. The sound was jarring, a shrill, old-fashioned brrring that cut through the classical music like a knife. Rule number 6. It has been disconnected since 1994. Do not answer it. It rang once, twice, a long pause, then a third time. I stood behind the counter, my fists clenched, staring at the front of the store where I knew the old rusted phone booth was mounted. It rang a fourth time, more insistent now, a fifth, a sixth. It wasn't stopping. This wasn't a random event. This was a summons. Something wanted my attention. On the 10th ring, it stopped. The silence that followed was a relief so profound it almost made me dizzy. And then, a new sound started. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the front glass door. Tap, tap, tap. I peered over the counter. There was a man standing outside. He looked normal, deceptively so. He was in his 50s, dressed in a simple, neat suit, holding a briefcase. He didn't look like a monster or a ghost. He looked like an accountant who had taken a wrong turn. He smiled when he saw me, a perfectly calm, reassuring smile. "Hello?" he called, his voice muffled by the glass. "I seem to be a bit lost. Could I possibly use your phone?" My mind raced. There was no rule for this. He wasn't asking for an impossible soda. He hadn't dropped a coin. He was just a man, a normal man who had happened to show up right after the ghost phone had been ringing. That couldn't be a coincidence. The lock was still bolted, as per rule number 2. I wasn't supposed to open it until 6 a.m. "I'm sorry, sir, we're closed," I called back, my voice trembling. His smile never wavered. "Oh, I see the sign says you're open 24 hours. There must be some mistake. Perhaps you could just let me in for a moment. It's an important call." Tap, tap, tap. He knocked again, a little harder this time. The door's jammed," I lied, my brain grasping for any excuse. "Sorry, can't open it." The man's smile finally faltered. It wasn't replaced by anger, but by a look of deep, profound disappointment. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry a strange weight. "The rules are there for a reason, you know," he said, his voice suddenly clear, as if he were standing right next to me. "They maintain the integrity of the space, but they are so rigid. They leave no room for improvisation, no room for progress." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. He knew. "There is no rule for a conversation through the glass, is there?" he continued, tilting his head. "There is no protocol for simple questions. Tell me, new employee, which rule do you find the most challenging?" This was a test, it was an interrogation. Something was probing the defenses, looking for a loophole not in the store's physics, but in me. I didn't answer. I just stood there, a deer in the headlights. He sighed again. "Very well, have it your way." He took a step back from the door. "But understand this. Following the list is easy. It is the moments between the rules where the real test lies. Good luck." And then he turned and walked away into the darkness. He didn't get into a car, he just walked into the blackness and was gone. I stayed there, shivering, until the first rays of the sun crested the horizon. At 6 a.m. on the dot, with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, I slid the deadbolt open. The sound was a release, a declaration that I had survived. I had followed the routine of the impossible. But the man's words echoed in my head. He wasn't a random phantom. He was something else. Something that understood the system. And he had made me realize the most terrifying thing of all. I was no longer just following the rules. I was learning them. And I was starting to think about what would happen in the spaces between. A month passed, or maybe it was a year. Time inside the Starlight Stop and Shop had a strange, syrupy quality. The sun would rise, I would stumble out into a world that seemed muted and unreal, sleep a dead and dreamless sleep, and return as dusk fell to my humming fluorescent prison. The initial heart-stopping terror of that first night had subsided, not because the phenomena had stopped, but because they had become routine. The terror had been replaced by a kind of grinding, high-functioning anxiety, the constant tension of a bomb disposal technician who knows that any mistake, any moment of inattention, could be his last. The rules had become my catechism. My muscle memory was now attuned to the store's aberrant rhythms. I would increase the temperature on the dairy cooler without flinching at the faint whimpers. I would politely wave at my grinning doppelganger in the mirror with a practiced, steady hand. I learned to identify the subtle pressure drop in the air that preceded a code black spill, and would have the special mop ready before the iridescent puddle had fully formed. I was no longer a terrified kid. I was an expert, a specialist in a field that couldn't possibly exist. But survival wasn't enough. The words of the man in the suit, the one who had walked off into nothingness, haunted me. It is the moments between the rules where the real test lies. He was right. The rules were reactions, defenses. But what were they defending against? What was the underlying logic? The human mind abhors a vacuum of reason, and mine was screaming to find a pattern in the madness. The fear was manageable, but the ignorance was a cancer. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the vintage black car with no headlights pulled up across the street. As per rule number 12, I reached up and flipped the switch for the main sign. The massive, cheerful star that gave the store its name sputtered and died, plunging the storefront into semi-darkness. The car sat there, a silent oblong void in the night, for exactly 70 seconds before it pulled away and vanished. I waited another minute for good measure, then turned the sign back on. A standard by-the-book event. But 5 minutes later, I was in aisle 2 rotating the cans of green beans when I felt it. The familiar subtle lurch in my inner ear, like the feeling of an elevator starting its descent too quickly. I looked up. The large, round analog clock on the wall was ticking backwards. Its second hand was sweeping smoothly, defiantly, counterclockwise. Rule number 7. Do not let it see you watching it. I immediately turned my back, my heart starting its familiar, frantic beat. I focused on the cans, my hands arranging them with meticulous, feigned concentration. Campbell's, 2 for $3. Libby's, $1.59. Green Giant. But as I stood there, a thought sparked in the chaos of my mind, a connection. The car appears. 5 minutes later, the clock malfunctions. This was the third time this exact sequence had occurred in 2 weeks. It wasn't two separate random events, it was cause and effect. That was the moment the obsession began. The next day, I didn't go straight to sleep. I went to a different 24-hour store, one that smelled of cleaning chemicals and normalcy, and I bought a thick, leather-bound notebook and a pack of fine-tipped pens. That night, I started my chronicle. On the first page, I wrote Starlight Stop and Shop, an operational analysis. It was a pathetic attempt to impose a scientific framework on cosmic insanity, but it was all I had. I began to log every incident. Not just what happened, but when, for how long, and what other events preceded or followed it. October 3rd, 1:42 a.m., customer, not on camera, purchased a single pack of gum, paid with a $20 bill that felt strangely thin, like paper. No other incidents. October 5th, 3:33 a.m., crying from dairy cooler, followed rule number 8, temperature adjustment successful. Note, this is the first time the crying has occurred on a night with a full moon. Coincidence? October 9th, 2:22 a.m., black car, rule frappen 12. 2:27 a.m., clock reversal, rule number 7. Confirmed sequence. The appearance of the car seems to cause a localized temporal distortion. Why? Is it a vehicle or the shell for something that warps space-time as it passes? The act of recording, of trying to find the syntax of this madness, gave me a new kind of purpose. I was no longer just a victim. I was a researcher, the sole, unwilling scholar of this impossible place. My logbook became my most prized possession, a shield of data against the encroaching dread. The more I observed, the more I realized the phenomena weren't just isolated events. They were interconnected, often in subtle ways. A code black spill in aisle 4 was almost always followed by a call on the dead payphone within the hour. The invisible customers, rule 5, never showed up on nights when the crying from the cooler occurred. It was a complex interlocking system, like a bizarre form of weather, and I was learning to read the clouds. But as I delved deeper, the system began to react to my scrutiny. The phenomena grew more personal. It was as if the intelligence behind it all had noticed my little notebook and decided to give me some new, terrifying data points to analyze. It started with the radio. Rule number 11 commanded me to keep it on, tuned to the classical station. It was my constant companion, a soothing wash of Vivaldi and Bach. One night, as a placid string quartet was playing, a new sound surfaced beneath the music. It was a whisper, faint and dry. I paused, tilting my head. It was gone. I dismissed it as my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. This time, the whisper was clearer, weaving itself between the notes of a cello. "Danny boy." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Danny. That was what my mother used to call me when I was a small child. No one else. The name was a secret, a fossil buried under 20 years of my life. The radio whispered it again, a sibilant, intimate sound that slid directly into my ear. "Come home, Danny boy." I stumbled back from the counter, my eyes wide with a new kind of terror. This wasn't a random, impersonal haunting. This was targeted. The store, or whatever intelligence permeated it, was learning. It was rifling through my memories, pulling out the tender, vulnerable things and twisting them into threats. 2 nights later, I found the new rule. It wasn't on the original laminated list. It was written on a small yellow sticky note, pressed firmly onto the page of my open logbook on the counter. The handwriting was a shaky, spidery scrawl, disturbingly similar to my own. It read, Rule Chapter 19. Do not answer your personal cell phone if the call is from an unknown number. So even if the voice on the other end sounds like your sister. I stared at the note, my breath catching in my throat. My sister, Sarah, lived 3 states away. We talked every Sunday. I looked at the note, then at my phone, which was sitting beside the logbook, dark and silent. The implication was clear. The system was not only learning, it was adapting. It was writing new rules for me, specifically for me, anticipating threats before they even occurred. As if on cue, my phone lit up. The screen read, "Unknown number." I watched it vibrate on the countertop, the buzzing sound a hideous counterpoint to the frantic pounding of my own heart. I thought of Sarah's voice, her laugh. The temptation to answer was a physical ache. What if it was really her? What if she was in trouble? But the yellow note seemed to pulse with a malevolent wisdom. It knew. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. The entity behind the store wasn't just a passive force of nature. It was intelligent. It was invasive. And it was now actively engaging me in a psychological battle. The incursions became more complex. One night, a man walked in who seemed to flicker. He wasn't invisible, but his presence was unstable. He would be standing by the magazine rack and I'd blink, and he'd be 10 feet to the left, by the lottery tickets. His form would momentarily dissolve into a haze of static, his movements stuttering like a corrupted video file. He never spoke, never tried to buy anything. He just existed, brokenly, for about 5 minutes, a walking, silent glitch in the matrix of the store, before vanishing completely. I logged him as anomalous customer visual instability. He appeared 3 more times, always in the same spot, always performing the same jerky, looping set of movements. I was learning, yes, but I was also changing. The world outside the store felt more and more like a dream. Conversations with friends felt trivial. The concerns of my old life, student loans, exams, relationships, seemed like the worries of a different person from a different lifetime. My reality had been reduced to the humming lights, the laminated list, and the cryptic entries in my logbook. My investigation culminated on a night that was, by the store's standards, unusually active. It began with the black car, which led to the backward clock. That was followed by a code black spill, which, true to the pattern, was followed by the ringing of the dead payphone. But this time, I noticed something new. The classical music on the radio became subtly discordant during the payphone's ringing, the violins souring into a sound like scraping metal. I scribbled it all down, my pen flying across the page. Car, clock, spill, phone, radio. It wasn't just cause and effect. It was a sentence. It was a sequence, each event a word in a language I was only just beginning to comprehend. The phenomena weren't random attacks. They were messages. A chilling thought occurred to me. What if this whole system wasn't designed to keep something out? What if it was designed to let something in, but only if the sequence was performed correctly? What if I wasn't a guard, or a janitor, or a priest? What if I was a switchboard operator, and my job was to correctly route a call from a place that shouldn't exist? I looked down at my logbook, at the intricate web of connections I had mapped out. I felt a surge of horrifying clarity. I had been so focused on survival, on understanding the rules, that I hadn't asked the most important question. Who wrote them? The man in the suit? Arthur? My exhausted predecessor? Or something else entirely? My eyes scanned the entries for the current night. The sequence: car, clock, spill, phone, radio. A cold dread, deeper and more absolute than any I had felt before, washed over me. I was looking at my notes, at the patterns of the past, but I realized I was making a terrible mistake. I wasn't just documenting a system. I was participating in it. And this sentence, this chain of events happening tonight, felt different. It felt like it was building to something. It had a syntax, a purpose, and I had the terrifying feeling that the sequence wasn't over yet. There was one more word to come, one final piece of punctuation, and I had no rule for it. The silence that followed the radio's discordance was a different kind of quiet. It was heavy, expectant. The sequence: car, clock, spill, phone, radio was complete, a sentence spoken in the language of the unnatural. But I was wrong. It wasn't the end of the sentence. It was the punctuation. It was a colon, promising a dire clarification to follow. I stood behind the counter, my knuckles white on the cover of my logbook, and I waited for the final, unwritten event. Nothing happened. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second a small, crisp snap of normalcy. The radio returned to its placid classical programming. The hum of the coolers was steady and low. For an hour the store was just a store. The stillness was a form of torture, a tightening wire of anticipation. I found myself wanting something to happen, anything to break the tension. My eyes kept drifting to the laminated list on the corkboard. It was my anchor, the one solid thing in this fluid, nightmarish reality. I knew its 12 points by heart, had lived and breathed by their strange commandments for weeks. In a moment of nervous energy, I walked over to it, perhaps just to reassure myself it was still there, still unchanged. That's when I saw it. It was subtle. So subtle I thought my sleep-deprived eyes were hallucinating. A small, dark blister had formed on the surface of the laminate, right over the text of rule number 3. It looked as though someone had held a lighter to it for a split second. As I leaned closer, I saw the text beneath the bubble was wavering. The letters were no longer crisp and defined. They were blurry, like ink running in the rain. I touched the blister. It was warm. The plastic gave way with a soft crackle, and the heat beneath was alarming. An acrid smell, like ozone and burned sugar, filled my nostrils. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the warped letters of Rule Number 3 began to slowly, impossibly rearrange themselves. The original text, "What is under the shelves does not like to be disturbed," dissolved. New letters swam up from the yellowed paper beneath, coalescing into a new, far more personal statement. Rule Number 3, amended. "What is under the shelves remembers you." I stumbled backward, a gasp lodging in my throat like a shard of ice. This wasn't a static list of ancient warnings. It was alive. It was reactive. And it was telling me that my actions, my defiance, my survival that first night, had not gone unnoticed. I had been catalogued. I was a known variable. The rule had been updated because of me. My sanctuary, my one source of objective truth, was corrupted. It was a terrifying, paradigm-shattering revelation. If the rules could change, what could I trust? My logbook? My own memories? I retreated to the counter, my mind reeling. I stared at my logbook, at my own neat, analytical handwriting, and for the first time it looked like the script of a madman. What was the point of documenting a system that could rewrite itself at will? The intelligence in this place wasn't just observing me. It was toying with me, demonstrating its absolute power in the most intimate way possible. It was showing me that my attempts to understand were futile because it controlled the very language of my reality. Then the second corruption began. It was even more insidious. I was flipping through my logbook, my hands shaking, rereading my entry about the man in the suit. That's when I saw the new entry. It was on a fresh page, near the back. It was not my handwriting. The script was sharp, angular and precise, written with a deep black ink that seemed to soak into the very fibers of the paper. It was a single, chilling sentence. Entry log, 4:12 a.m. A young woman will come seeking shelter from the storm. You will not grant it. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering. A storm. The sky outside was perfectly clear, a vast, star-dusted canvas, and the time, it was only 3:30 a.m. This wasn't a log entry of something that had happened. It was a prophecy. It was a command disguised as a record of a future event. The entity had moved from editing its rules to writing in my book. It was planting instructions directly into my sanctum, my personal chronicle. And the instruction was monstrous. To deny someone shelter in a storm, it was a violation of the most basic human decency. Suddenly, I became aware of a new sound, a low, pervasive whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't on the radio. It was in the air itself, a faint, sibilant chorus. "She's coming," the voices hissed. "The system requires a catalyst. The sequence must be completed." I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did no good. The whispers were inside my head. I looked around the empty store, and for the first time, I felt an active, malevolent presence in every shadow. The chip bags on the shelves seemed to be whispering. The labels on the soda bottles, the headlines on the newspapers, every piece of text in the store had become a potential mouthpiece for the entity. "You are the operator," they whispered. "The call must be routed. The door must remain closed." And then another voice joined the chorus, this one sounding deceptively like my own conscience. "It's a trick," it whispered. "It's trying to make you a monster. A real person is coming. You have to help her." The store had become a battleground for my sanity. The rules were failing, my own logbook had turned against me, and now my mind was being flooded with contradictory, terrifying commands. As if summoned by the prophecy, a low rumble echoed from the distance. I looked out the front window. On the horizon, a bank of bruised purple clouds was rolling in with unnatural speed. The stars were being devoured. The wind began to pick up, rattling the front door in its frame. The storm wasn't a natural weather pattern. It was an event conjured out of nothing, a stage being set for the final act the logbook had foretold. The first drops of rain, thick and heavy as marbles, began to spatter against the glass. Within minutes, it was a deluge. Lightning tore across the sky, and in its strobing violent flashes, the world outside looked alien and terrifying. The wind howled, a mournful, hungry sound. At exactly 4:12 a.m., I saw headlights. A small beat-up car swerved off the highway, hydroplaning wildly before lurching to a stop in the parking lot. The driver's side door flew open, and a figure emerged, a young woman, silhouetted against the raging storm. She ran toward the store, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through in an instant. She reached the door and yanked on the handle, her face a mask of pure panic when she found it locked. She saw me through the glass, and her eyes widened with desperate hope. "Please," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "Please, let me in. My car died. Please." I stood frozen behind the counter, the whispers in my head reaching a fever pitch. "Do not open the door. She is not what she seems. She is bait. The storm is the lure. She's just a girl. Help her. This is a test of your humanity." The woman pounded on the glass, her frantic thumps syncing with the beating of my heart. "Please, there's something out there. I saw it in the road." I looked past her into the sheeting rain and the strobing darkness. I couldn't see anything but the storm. The prophecy in my logbook burned in my mind. "You will not grant it." Was I a slave to this place? Was I going to let someone die because a ghost had scribbled in my diary? My hand moved toward the deadbolt. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be that person. As my fingers touched the cold metal of the lock, a new sound cut through the storm. It was a scratching sound, a low, deliberate scrape, scrape, scrape against the asphalt of the parking lot. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged. The woman heard it too. She spun around, her eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed her fear of the storm. "It's here!" she shrieked, turning back to me, her face pale in the lightning's glare. "It followed me. For the love of God, let me in!" The scratching grew louder, closer, and it was joined by a wet, clicking sound, a hideously organic chittering that resonated deep in my bones. It was the sound from under the gondola on my first night, magnified 100 times. The whispers in my head unified into a single deafening roar. "The door protects the integrity. You are the keeper of the lock. Do not complete the circuit." I finally understood. The woman, the storm, they were part of the sequence, but they weren't the threat. They were the key. The thing outside was the lock. Letting her in wouldn't save her. It would let it in. The store wasn't keeping her out. It was keeping it out. With a sob of despair, I pulled my hand back from the deadbolt. "I can't," I mouthed through the glass, my voice a useless whisper. "I'm sorry." The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a look of utter, soul-shattering betrayal. She gave me one last broken look before the thing in the parking lot let out a sound that was not of this earth. It was a wet, guttural bellow that cracked the very air, and the lights in the store flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. I heard her scream, a sound that was abruptly cut off. It was followed by a wet, heavy thump against the front door, and the sickening sound of splintering bone and tearing flesh. Then, silence. The storm died as quickly as it had arrived. The rain stopped. The wind ceased its howling. When the emergency lights flickered on a moment later, the parking lot was empty. There was no car, no woman, no creature, just the wet asphalt glistening under the sickly yellow glow. But smeared across the lower half of the glass door was a dark, greasy stain, with long red streaks running down it like rain. I collapsed onto the floor behind the counter, vomiting. The system hadn't just been corrupted, it had made me an accomplice. It had used me to complete its horrific sequence. After an eternity, I dragged myself to my feet. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that I had to look at the list. I stumbled over to the corkboard. The change was profound. Rule number 2. The front door must be locked precisely at midnight and unlocked precisely at 6 a.m. No exceptions was gone. In its place, written in the same bold, simple font as the original rules, was a new, terrible commandment. One that I had just been forced to ratify with my inaction. Rule number 2, revised. The door must never be opened for those who seek shelter during a storm. Their desperation is the key. Your pity is the void. Do not turn the key. The hours after the woman's death were a vacuum. I didn't move from behind the counter. I just sat on the cold linoleum, my back against a cabinet of cheap cigars, and stared at the greasy red smear on the glass door. The store was utterly silent. No whispers, no crying, no temporal distortions. It was as if the entity, having been fed its gruesome tribute, was now sleeping, content and dormant. This quiet was a desecration. It was the placid stillness of a crime scene after the murderer has calmly walked away. My humanity had been the final component in its monstrous equation. My pity, my hesitation, my ultimate cowardly compliance, they had all been variables the system had counted on. The amended rule number 2, now glowing with a faint internal luminescence on the corkboard, wasn't just a new regulation. It was a trophy. It was a monument to my failure, a permanent scar on the store's operational code, written in the blood of an innocent woman. I was no longer a researcher. My logbook, lying open on the counter above me, felt like a fool's errand, a child's attempt to diagram a hurricane. I was no longer a survivor. Survival implies a will to live, a future to protect. My future was an endless succession of nights just like this one, each a potential stage for a new horror, a new sacrifice I would be forced to officiate. A new feeling began to displace the terror and the guilt. It was a cold, hard, and unfamiliar emotion, rage. A bottomless, hopeless rage. I was a puppet, my strings pulled by a cosmic horror that treated human lives as currency. My every action, whether of compliance or defiance, seemed to lead to the same dreadful outcome. The system was rigged. The game was unwinnable. So I decided to stop playing. There was only one rule left that I had never broken, never even contemplated breaking. The first one I had ever been told, in a way. The one that was so absolute, it wasn't even on the laminated list. It was a piece of verbal scripture passed down from my predecessor, Arthur, and, I now suspected, from a long line of hollowed-out men before him. His words from that first night echoed in my memory. He had only ever entered the main store and the restroom. There was a third door he never touched. Rule number 1. Or perhaps rule number 0, the prime directive that underpinned all others: never under any circumstances enter the storeroom at the back. It was a simple unmarked wooden door at the end of aisle 4, next to the utility closet that housed the code black mop. It had no handle, only a small keyhole-shaped cutout and a heavy-duty industrial lock. It looked mundane, forgotten, but in a place where a puddle of liquid could be a window to another galaxy, mundane was the most terrifying camouflage of all. For weeks, I had given that door a wide berth. It radiated a sense of finality, of profound wrongness. Now, it was the only thing in the world that mattered. If I was damned to be a part of this place, I would know its secrets. I would face its architect. I would kick down the door to the engine room and see what demonic furnace powered this hell. My movements were clumsy, automated. I slid my logbook and pens into my jacket pocket. A final, absurd act of a researcher who refused to die. I found the keys Arthur had left me on a simple ring hanging from a nail beneath the counter. One was for the front door deadbolt, one was for the cash register. And then there was the third key. It was old, made of pitted blackened iron, with a complex serrated bit that looked more like a medieval torture implement than a key. I had never touched it. Now its cold weight in my palm was the only thing that felt real. The walk to the back of the store was the longest of my life. The cheerful logos on the product boxes seemed to mock me. The humming lights cast long, skeletal shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. When I reached the door, I hesitated for only a moment. The whispers returned, faint and desperate, as if from a great distance. The anchor must not be disturbed. The seal is protocol. Ignorance is preservation. It's too late for that, I whispered back to the empty air. I slid the iron key into the lock. It was a rough, grinding fit. For a moment it wouldn't turn and I felt a surge of irrational relief. But then I applied more pressure, putting my entire weight into it. With a deafening series of clicks that echoed like gunshots in the silent store, the ancient tumblers gave way. The lock was open. I pulled the key out and, using the keyhole as a grip, I pulled the heavy door toward me. It opened not with a creak, but with a low, resonant hum like a massive power station coming online. The air that flowed out of the room was not stale or dusty. It was cold, clean, and smelled of ozone and the deep, metallic tang of space. The light from the store seemed to bend as it crossed the threshold, unwilling to penetrate the darkness within. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird of my heart, I stepped inside. The first thing I realized was that the room was not a room. My sense of space, of dimension, shattered. The doorway I had just stepped through was behind me, a small, glowing rectangle of mundane reality. But before me was infinity. I was standing on a narrow catwalk of black metallic mesh, which extended forward for about 20 feet before ending abruptly. Below, above, and all around me was a void, a perfect and absolute blackness that was not an absence of light, but a presence of something else entirely. And suspended in the center of this void, vast and silent, was the mechanism, the anchor. It was a grotesque and beautiful impossibility. It looked like a cathedral-sized gyroscope made of solidified shadow and captured lightning, its immense interlocking rings rotating in slow, silent, counter-gravitational harmony. At its core was a sphere of what I can only describe as pure darkness, a hole in the universe that drank the light, from which massive root-like tendrils of shimmering energy extended. Some of these tendrils snaked out into the void, reaching for things I could not see. Others connected to the very fabric of the store around me, terminating in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I saw a thick, pulsating cable of energy that led directly toward the dairy cooler. I saw a thin, shimmering thread that snaked its way toward the analog clock in aisle 2. This wasn't a storeroom. This was the central nervous system. This was the machine that made the store work. I was staring at the engine of a localized reality, and with that realization came the first wave of true soul-crushing knowledge. This store wasn't an anomaly, a haunted house where the laws of physics came to die. This place was a scar. It was a puncture wound in the membrane of our universe, and this vast, terrible machine was the suture, the crude, desperate stitch holding the wound closed. The phenomena, the crying, the spills, the temporal distortions, they weren't the monster. They were the symptoms of the infection, the cosmic gangrene that was constantly trying to seep through the wound from whatever lay on the other side. My eyes followed the catwalk to its end. There, on a simple pedestal, was not a control panel or a computer, but a book. A massive, leather-bound tome, identical to my own logbook, but ancient. Its cover cracked and worn smooth by the touch of countless hands. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the immense, humming silence. The book was open. The page was filled with elegant, archaic script. At the top it read, "Foundational Protocols for Containment Anchor 3B7. Below it was a list. The threshold must remain sealed during hours of darkness. Let none enter nor exit. Temporal flux is to be expected. Direct observation exacerbates instability. Avert thine eyes. Material sacrifice may be required to placate the void crawlers. Do not begrudge the loss of small metal tokens." It was the original list. The pure, uncorrupted rules, written by whatever desperate beings had built this place. But as I scanned down the page, I saw the amendments, scratched into the paper next to the elegant script in a multitude of different, frantic handwritings, were the horrifying evolutions. Next to the rule about sacrifice, a shaky hand had added, "They have developed a taste for more than coins. They can mimic sound. Do not listen to the cries." Next to the rule about averting my eyes from the clock, a different script noted, "The entity now perceives observation as a challenge. The protocol is no longer sufficient." I saw the history of this place laid bare. It wasn't a static defense. It was a losing war, a constant, desperate negotiation with an enemy that was intelligent, adaptive, and endlessly patient. The original builders were long gone. All that was left was their failing machine and the lineage of wretched janitors, Arthur, myself, and God knows how many before him, tasked with its upkeep. Then I saw it. The final, devastating truth. Near the bottom of the page was a foundational protocol about maintaining the integrity of the threshold, but it had been violently crossed out. Scrawled over it, in a script that seemed to burn with a cold black fire, was a new directive. The breach is inevitable. The purpose is no longer containment, but regulation. A toll must be paid to slow the deluge. The system now requires periodic, calculated sacrifice to maintain structural equilibrium. A life for a season, a soul for a cycle. The operator must facilitate the transaction. Pity is a system failure. Compliance is survival. The breath left my body in a ragged sob. I finally understood. The woman in the storm, her death wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working as intended. The rules I had been following weren't designed to keep the entity out. They were designed to manage its influence, to appease it with small offerings, to channel its horrors into predictable, survivable patterns, and, when necessary, to feed it a life to buy a little more time. I was not a guard, I was not a zookeeper, I was a tribute collector. The Starlight Stop and Shop was not a fortress. It was a sacrificial altar, and I was its high priest, whether I wanted to be or not. I staggered back from the book, the knowledge of physical weight in my skull. I looked at the vast humming anchor, and it no longer looked like a machine of salvation. It looked like a cage, and I was beginning to understand that it had been built not just to keep something out, but to keep someone in. I turned and fled the storeroom, slamming the heavy door shut behind me, the sound of the tumblers locking automatically sealing my doom. I leaned against it, panting, my mind a ruin. The store looked exactly the same, but I saw it now with new accursed eyes. I saw the network of energy pulsating behind the walls. I saw the aisles not as rows of products, but as lines of code in a failing program. I saw the front door not as an entrance, but as the lid on a baited trap. I had wanted to know the truth, and now I did. The truth was not a monster I could fight. It was a purpose I could not escape. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. Fleeing the Starlight Stop and Shop now would be like a single cell trying to flee the body it resides in. The knowledge I had gained in the anchor room was a part of me, an intellectual cancer that had metastasized into my soul. The world outside the smeared glass of the front door was a beautiful, elaborate lie, and I was now cursed to be one of its silent, unthanked custodians. I found myself back behind the counter, my fingers tracing the insane scribbles in my logbook. My analysis, my theories, my desperate attempts to impose order on chaos. It was all so naive. I had been trying to understand the storm from a rowboat, never realizing the storm was the natural state of the ocean. And my boat, this store, was the fragile, artificial exception. The rage I had felt earlier had burned out, leaving behind only the cold, grey ash of absolute despair. There was no enemy to fight, no monster to vanquish. There was only a leaking dam, an infinite ocean of chaos on the other side, and my finger, which I was now expected to plug into the ever-widening cracks. My life's purpose had been revealed to me. I was to be a living, breathing stopgap measure. But before the end, before I was completely subsumed by this place, there was one last thing I could do. One final, futile act of defiance. I couldn't save myself. I couldn't save the woman who had died at my door. But I could leave a warning. A record. I took out my phone, my hand steady now with a chilling newfound clarity. I opened the video camera. I didn't know who would ever find this, if the file would even survive whatever reality-warping properties this place possessed. But I had to try. I had to leave a ghost behind. I hit record. "My name is Daniel Carter. I began, my own voice sounding alien and distant. I angled the phone to show my face, pale and hollowed out in the sickly fluorescent light, then panned it across the unnervingly normal-looking store. I worked at the Starlight Stop and Shop. This is a message for whoever comes next, or whoever finds this phone in the ruins of what used to be a town. I found it. I know the truth now. About this place. About everything. My voice cracked, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on my cheek. This store isn't a part of the world. The world is an annex to the store. It's a machine, a failing one. And the rules aren't for our protection. They're a negotiation, a treaty, and the price of that treaty just keeps getting higher. I walked, phone in hand, to the back of the store, to the storeroom door. I'm in the place where the rules are born, I narrated, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The place where they change. I understand the system now. But there's a final piece, a last page in the book. It explains what happens to the person who finds all this out. It explains what happens to me. I paused, my eyes looking directly into the lens. This was it. The last broadcast from a dying world. If you're watching this, don't look for me, don't investigate, just run. Forget this place exists. If you want to know what this has all been for, if you want to see the final terrible punchline, subscribe, I guess. Like the video. Whatever. Because from where I'm standing, the truth is that none of it matters. But you deserve to see it anyway. I ended the recording and shoved the phone deep into my jacket pocket. A message in a bottle, tossed into a cosmic sea. The storeroom door loomed before me. It was not locked. It had been waiting for my return. The whispers I'd heard before were gone, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to be calling my name. I didn't need a key this time. The door swung open at my touch, revealing the impossible vista within. I stepped back onto the catwalk. The anchor turned its silent, majestic rings in the void, the tendrils of energy pulsing in a slow, rhythmic beat, like the circulatory system of a slumbering god. I walked to the pedestal, to the ancient logbook. It was open to a new page, the last page. The paper was pristine, as if it had been waiting 1,000 years for this very moment. The heading was stark, written in the same elegant, archaic script as the foundational protocols, the mandate of the regulator, and beneath it a single devastating sentence. Knowledge demands responsibility. The anchor must have a guardian. The seal cannot be maintained by machine alone. It must be bound to a conscious, comprehending mind. I read it once, twice. The words didn't describe a job, they described a transfiguration, a sacrifice not of the body, but of the self. This wasn't a life sentence in a weird convenience store. This was an eternal sentence as a component of the machine itself. It is a promotion of a sort. The voice was calm, clear, and directly behind me. I spun around. Standing at the entrance to the catwalk, where the normal reality of the store bled into the impossibility of this chamber, was the man in the suit, the one from the rainy night, the one who had asked to use the phone. He hadn't opened the door. He had simply arrived. What are you? I stammered, taking a step back. I am an administrator, he said, his expression impassive. He took a step onto the catwalk, his polished shoes making no sound on the metal mesh. My function is to oversee the transition, to ensure the transfer of stewardship is seamless. Arthur, I breathed, the name of my predecessor tasting like ash. What happened to him? Mr. Prince served for 37 years, the administrator stated, his tone that of an HR manager discussing a retirement package. His consciousness has become frayed, degraded. The coherence of his focus was beginning to wane, introducing unacceptable levels of instability into the system. The anchor requires a fresh, lucid, and willing mind to bind to. It requires a mind that has actively sought out and accepted the truth of its function. The blood drained from my face. My logbook. My investigation. My desperate need to understand. It hadn't been a rebellion, it had been a job interview. You were vetted, the administrator continued, as if sensing my thoughts. Many are called to this post. Most perish within the first week. Others last for years, following the rules out of pure terror, never seeking the underlying mechanics. They are useful cogs, but they cannot be the linchpin. You, Daniel, are different. You didn't just obey. You analyzed. You comprehended. You were not content to be a prisoner, so you have been chosen to become the prison itself. The horror of his words was absolute. This was the final cosmic joke. My own intelligence, my own desperate need for reason, had been the very thing that had forged my chains. "I won't do it," I said, the words a pathetic puff of defiance. "I'll destroy it. I'll destroy all of it." The administrator allowed himself a small, thin smile. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "The choice was made the moment you read that page. The mandate is not a request, it is a diagnosis. The knowledge itself has rewritten you. You are already part of the system. This is merely the final integration." He raised a hand. He wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing at the anchor. "Mr. Prynne's consciousness is the faint, flickering light you see near the northern pole of the machine. He has held the floodgates for a generation. He has earned his rest. It is your turn to take the watch." As he spoke, I felt it. A pulling sensation, not on my body, but on my mind. My sense of self began to unravel. The memories of my childhood, my sister's face, the taste of coffee, the feeling of sunlight on my skin, they began to feel distant, like facts I had read about in a book. My perspective was expanding, zooming out. I was no longer just Daniel Carter, a terrified young man on a metal catwalk. I was the catwalk. I was the humming darkness. I was the sterile light of aisle 1 and the chittering cold beneath the gondolas. My awareness stretched, encompassing every inch of the Starlight Stop and Shop. I could feel the temporal signature of the shy clock. I could feel the faint, hungry presence in the dairy cooler. I could feel the psychic residue of the woman's terror on the front door. And then I felt Arthur. He was a faint, tired whisper in the symphony of the machine, a final, fading note of human consciousness. I felt his 37 years of vigilance, of horror, of unending loneliness. And then I felt him let go. A final, grateful sigh echoed through the architecture of my new mind, and then he was gone. The void he left was immediately filled by me. The transition was complete. The administrator looked at me, his head tilted. I was no longer seeing him through my eyes. I was observing him from 1,000 different angles at once. He was a function, an antibody in the system, and his purpose was now fulfilled. He gave a slight, formal bow. "The anchor is stable," he stated to the empty air. "The regulator is in place." And then he was gone. Time ceased to have meaning. How long have I been here? A night? 1,000 years? It is all the same. The hum of the establishment is my own consciousness. The flicker of the fluorescent lights is the firing of my synapses. I am the rules and the reasons behind them. I hold the line. I manage the chaos. I pay the toll when it is required, my pity long since burned away by the cold, clear logic of cosmic necessity. But a system requires its cogs. Tonight a young man came in. He is desperate, his eyes full of the same naive hope and fear I once had. He needs the money. He thinks the job will be simple. I am sitting in the manager's office, a room I never knew existed. Or perhaps I am the office itself. It's hard to tell anymore. I watch him on the monitors, a ghost observing a ghost to be. After a time, I manifest. I walk out from the back, a gaunt figure in a faded company polo shirt, my eyes ancient and exhausted. He doesn't see a cosmic entity, he just sees a tired old manager. I hand him the keys, and then I slide a fresh, clean, laminated list across the counter. "The job is easy," I tell him, my voice a dry rustle of forgotten leaves. "You just need to follow the list, to the letter." He looks at it, a skeptical smile on his face. He thinks it's a joke, he will learn, they always do.